Well, howdy, friends and neighbors. This is your friend Hank Snow speaking, and on this record I will try to answer many of the questions that have been asked me during my career. To begin my story, I was born on the 9th of May in the year of 1914 in a small town on the Atlantic coast and in the province of Nova Scotia, Canada, called Brooklyn. Here I lived with my three sisters, my mother and dad, until I was 8 years old. At the age of 8, I was the victim of a broken home. My mother and dad were divorced at that time, sending two of my sisters to an orphanage and my oldest sister to work in a shoe factory. Lucky little old me was rescued by my grandparents, and I lived with them and got whatever schooling I could until I was 11 years old. The amount of my education, however, ended when I passed the 5th grade. Due to the love and respect I had for my dear mother, and on the contrary, the extreme loneliness and unhappiness that I experienced during my stay with my grandparents gave me the urge to steal away very often and go visit my mother, who at that time was doing daily housework for a wealthy family in Liverpool, 2 miles away. I could always expect a good thrashing when returning from my visit with Mother, but the warm love and consolement I would receive from her was well worth it. You see, friends, my grandmother and Mother just didn't see eye to eye, as she was my father's mother, and of course, as you may guess, held my mother responsible for the divorce. Well, just let's compromise a bit here and say it was a 50-50 deal. At the age of 12, I ran away from my grandparents, never to return again. I didn't know it then, but I was actually jumping from the frying pan into the fire, as Mother and I then moved to a little town 75 miles away known as Lunenburg, and shortly after we moved to Lunenburg, Mother remarried to a fellow whose occupation was a fisherman. My young boyhood from this time on was, literally speaking, hell on earth. I was treated by him, mildly speaking, like a dog. Yes, I took many beatings from him, friends, and still carry scars across my body that were left by his ham-like hands. My mother, however, had no other choice, as bad health would not permit her to continue her daily work, and she had to actually rescue me from an orphanage also. And then when I became aware of the fact that my presence was beginning to interfere with their marriage, I shipped aboard one of the large fishing schooners and started to sail the sea. However, after 4 years of this rugged life, drifting around on the cold and ice-covered Atlantic, and being shipwrecked once, nearly losing my life, when we experienced a 100-mile-an-hour hurricane which swept the decks of the ship and stripped the ship of its sails, and nearly piling up on an island in the Atlantic Ocean known as Cape Sable Island, or as the fishermen called it, the Ocean's Graveyard, as it was famously known over the years for countless shipwrecks and for taking the lives of thousands of men, women, and children. On this particular night, there were 6 of our neighboring fishing vessels sunk within a 100-mile area around us and claiming the lives of 122 men, most all of whom came from the little county known as Lunenburg County. I now had my fill of this life, especially after many close calls by steamers, nearly running us down during heavy fog on the Atlantic at night, and many narrow escapes nearly running into drifting icebergs, some of which were as huge as mountains. Therefore, after my 4 years at sea, I was through. However, it was during these 4 years that I made my first debut before an audience. I used to sing to the crew in my boyish-like way, and also would throw in the odd mouth organ tune and a little tap dance that I used to do as a child. And to show their appreciation for my amateurish-like talent, they would often give me pieces of candy which their wives would make for them to take on their different voyages to sea. Their encouragement went a long way with me, friends and neighbors. From the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, one of the well-known fishing grounds, to the lumber woods back of Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, from there to selling newspapers, peddling fish from door to door, a full-of-brush salesman, an errand boy in a drugstore, a store clerk, a jewelry salesman, a stevedore unloading cargoes of salt, coal, etc., and many other jobs too numerous to mention. However, all through these hardships, I was trying to cultivate my voice and improve my singing. And then after hearing the first recording of the man who inspired me most to become a singer, the late and great Jimmy Rogers, nothing could hold me. I was determined to become an internationally known singer like the famous Jimmy or bust. Then one day, after getting paid for 15 days' work, helping to unload a cargo of salt from Turk's Island, and for which I was paid $30 for the 2 weeks' work, I bought my first guitar. A cheap little old thing, but to me the greatest thing I had ever possessed. I would then listen to the late Jimmy's records and would try to sing his songs word for word just as he did. I was a long way from the beautiful voice and the guitar stylings of this great artist. But friends, I kept trying both to improve my voice and to play the guitar as Jimmy did. After appearing in several local shows, trying to raise money for the needy, and with the encouragement of the good down-to-earth country people, I picked up enough courage to write a radio station in Halifax, Canada, 75 miles away. I still have the letter that I received from the manager of this station, whose name was Major William Coates Borrett. The letter was dated March 14th, 1933, and reads as follows. Dear Mr. Snow, we have your letter, and I regret to tell you that we are not able to offer you anything at this station. All the artists who appear here are paid for the sponsors of the programs, and unless a sponsor were to ask for you, we could not do anything for you. If, however, your services are required, we have your name on file. Yours very truly, signed, William Coates Borrett, Managing Director. However, I did not let this discourage me, and here is what I did. I took part of the $30 I had earned in helping unload the shipload of salt and went to the nearest dime store, where I purchased several different items such as bobby pins, soap, razor blades, toothbrushes, etc. And these, along with my guitar under my arm, I started on a commercial hitchhiking trip to Halifax. I would go from house to house along the highway to Halifax and display my merchandise, for which I was selling for double the money. And if the housewife bought an item, it was understood that I would entertain them with a couple of songs. I doubled my money and arrived in Halifax knowing only one family in the big city who I could turn to for a couple of days' lodging. I had met them prior to this visit in Lunenburg, but I was just slightly acquainted with them. However, they were very kind to me, and after I had performed my amateurish-like talents to them, they, too, gave me a lot of encouragement. I then called the radio station and set up an appointment to have an audition, not mentioning, of course, that I was the same fellow who had written to them a few months earlier. When I walked into CHNS in Halifax that afternoon at 2:30, a very pleasant smile greeted me. He asked me if he could help me, if he had only known. It was a man who was to mean much to me in my hard fight to stardom. A man that I give much credit for the success I have achieved over the long, discouraging years. A man who is loved and respected by everyone, Mr. Cecil A. Landry. After I told Mr. Landry who I was and the nature of my visit, these are the words he used. Just a minute, Clarence, and I'll hear your stuff. Well, stuff was right, as due to lack of experience certainly added to the misery he was about to encounter during my audition. But much to my surprise, friends, he liked my work and asked me to prepare a show to go on the air that same night at 7 o'clock. He told me to be thinking up something to use as a theme song, but not knowing what a theme song was and being very careful not to display my ignorance, I said I would. I then waited until I got back to my friends to find out what on earth was a theme song. However, I was before the microphone that night doing my first radio program, and I shall never forget it. I was so nervous I could hardly hold my guitar. Times got extremely rough from this on, as my radio show was strictly sustaining, and I had no other source of income. I struggled on, however, doing my weekly show over this station, and as I remember, I was advertised in the local paper as Clarence Snow and his guitar. This, however, was long before I adopted the name Hank. I continued to live with my friends in Halifax, who opened their hearts to me. And then one day, through a friend of mine, I met my charming and wonderful wife, Minnie, and above all places, at a Halloween party. It was not long after this that we were married, and although I was not working, as it was just about impossible to find a job during this terrific depression, which had hit all across Canada. But my new bride had a steady job and was working as a chocolate dipper in a local chocolate factory and was making approximately $6 per week and had saved over the years around $150, which we used to finance our wedding as the one thing her parents insisted upon, and that was a good wedding. And I'm certainly glad they did, because I thought my new bride certainly deserved nothing but the best on what we hoped would be our one and only marriage, and which, thanks to the good Lord, it was. After our wedding and all the trimmings had been paid for, we had exactly 50 cents to our name. So we were forced to start out in life on the well-known credit plan. Therefore, we bought on credit $50 worth of furniture from a credit store and started housekeeping in 2 small rooms in the slums of the city of Halifax. I continued my radio work weekly, and my wife continued her job as a chocolate dipper until finally one day I was offered a job selling fuller brushes on a commission basis. This I took immediately. But unfortunately, they gave me a route in the slum district of the city where there was no money to be had from any household. And after 6 months, I had to quit because I was wearing out my one and only pair of shoes and no signs of income for the next pair. Speaking of wearing out my only pair of shoes, it is quite easy now to remember that I had worn holes through the bottom of these shoes and was forced to cut out small pieces of cardboard to use as inner soles. And of course, these lasted until I made the first few steps on a wet or damp sidewalk, and then these had to be replaced, which was, as you can see, very often. People back in those days, friends, were under the impression that if you were a radio artist, why, my goodness, you were bound to be in the big money. But friends, let me let you in on a little secret. While doing my sustaining show over radio station CHNS in Halifax, I was on city relief and had to stand in a bread line once a week to pick up my bread, milk, and coal tickets. And for this handout, I had to work 1 day a week on the city streets. And the very first job they gave me was picking and shoveling ice from the streets and, as luck would run, put me to work right in front of the radio station. Well, I just pulled my old worn-out hat down over my eyes and with head down went right on digging as the announcers continued to walk in and out of the radio station. However, I don't believe they ever did recognize me. If they did, they were very nice about it because they never did say anything. Now, coming back to Mr. Landry again, it was he, friends, who taught me a great deal in the handling of lyrics. And while working at this station for several years, I gained a lot of very valuable experience through him. Plus the fact we had a lot of fun. You know, folks, he was the man who recorded my voice for the very first time. Yes, the very first time I had ever heard my voice played back to me. I still have that old record, so let me play just a wee bit of it. That is, if you will excuse the wornness of the old record, which was recorded on one of the first disc cutters back in the year of 1936. Now, here's a little bit of the song, Old Faithful.
Oh, faithful, we rode the ring together. Oh.
And there you are, friends, the first time I ever heard my voice played back to me. Sounds a little rough, doesn't it? Now let's turn this old record over and hear a bit of the hymn that was a favorite of both Mr. Landry and I, in which Mr. Landry sings the lead part, and I sing the high or harmony part. And here it is, folks, the Old Rugged Cross.
Ladies and gentlemen, and Jonas, the old maestro, are going to do a little number here at the cross. All right, Clarence?
Mr. Landry and I spent many an hour together, which were always filled with fun. I remember one day in particular, we were cutting a number of songs to be used on CHNS when I was away on personal appearance tours, and I was to do a song called The Wreck of the Old 97. Mr. Landry was to make train imitations with sandpaper between some verses, and then was to play the Jew's harp between other verses. I got confused and lost my place in the words, and it got us all adrift. He didn't know where he was supposed to come in with the train effect or the Jew's harp, and believe you me, it was a real frolic. Let me play this particular record just to give you an idea of how it turned out and how we got all adrift on the wreck of the old 97. Mr. Landry passed away in the early 1950s, friends, and we lost not only a great man, but he was also a great engineer and the life of all parties and loved by everyone everywhere who knew him. About this time, things seemed to get and to look a little brighter for me. CHNS got a sponsor who was interested in sponsoring my show, and then I obtained a program on the Canadian Farm Hour, which went coast to coast across Canada over the CBC network. Later on, another coast-to-coast show with a band from the city of Montreal, Canada, and other shows. By now, I had enough nerve, and with the encouragement given to me by Mr. Landry and others, to write to the RCA Victor Company in Montreal, several hundred miles away. I still have the first letter I received from RCA Victor and from Mr. A.H. Joseph, dated April the 18th, 1935, and reads as follows. Dear Sir, we have received yours of April the 9th, inquiring as to the possibility of your recording for RCA Victor Records. While at the moment we have a large amount of talent under contract to record the type of music in which you specialize, we are always interested, however, in trying out new artists. Though to do this, it is of course necessary to be present at our studio in this city, which is the only place in Canada where we record. If you happen to be in Montreal, we will certainly be pleased to make a test record, though we could hardly recommend that you come here solely on the possibility of your being engaged, as even if your test did prove satisfactory, we could not give you any guarantee that we would be able to use you in the near future. You do not state whether you write your own compositions such as the late Jimmy Rogers and Wilf Carter, and unless you have original numbers, it is very unlikely that we would be interested, as our present catalog includes so many of the standard old-time tunes at the present time. Very truly yours, signed A.H. Joseph, Manager, Repertoire and Recording Department. However, this didn't stop little old Hanky, and I used the same approach with RCA Victor as I had used on station CHNS. So I took the old train, known as the Ocean Limited, and headed to Montreal and to Mr. Joseph, head of the recording department of RCA Victor. After a brief talk with him, and as he stated in his letter I read just a minute ago, he would not be interested unless I had my own and original material. I told him a little white lie and said I had several numbers I had written previously. Well, it's a good thing he didn't ask me for the titles or to sing them. However, I then went back to my little 2x4 room in the hotel and wrote my very first two songs entitled The Prison Cowboy and Lonesome Blue Yodel. Let me play just a verse or two of The Prison Cowboy, just to give you an idea of how my first Victor recording sounded and my first attempt in writing a song, okay? I hope you have heard the story and the song called 21 Years. All about two lovers parted, all their sorrow, pain, and didn't get overly rich on the sale of this particular record, and I can remember my first royalty check was in the amount of $1.96. This, I thought, was the end of my recording career, but I was wrong. Mr. Joseph was very kind to me, and friends, he gave me the second chance at recording. It was my next recording a year later that helped me to get acquainted across the Dominion of Canada, and although the sales of this recording were very slim, it was still classed in those days as a smash hit and was called the Blue Velvet Band. Let's play just a little bit of it, okay? Well, I'll be doggone. Look who's here. If it ain't my old friend Cactus Joe. Well, Joe, you're just in time to hear that beautiful old song all the cowboys out here been raving about so much, my Blue Velvet Band. So if you'll just pass me that old cigar box over there by the bench, I'll try and sing it for you. Thanks. If you listen to a story I'll tell you of a girl who once lived in this world, a girl who once was my sweetheart. She was known as the Blue Velvet Band. From this on, fortunately, my records kept selling extremely well across Canada and had started selling in far-off Australia. But the going was still very rough. And it was during this time that our one and only child was born in a charity ward at the Salvation Army Hospital in Halifax, and who naturally I named after my idol, the late Jimmy Rogers.